Hello, everyone. This is our last video lecture on coding diseases of the cardiovascular system. We'll be covering cerebral vascular hemorrhage and other cardiovascular topics. Okay, I think we left off here. Now we're going to talk a little bit about cerebral vascular disease. These are codes that fall into code categories I-60 through I-69. These are very specific. They describe the various forms of cerebral vascular accidents, otherwise referred to as strokes. These codes will tell us whether a condition is a cerebral hemorrhage or an infarction due to thrombosis, embolism, or unspecified occlusion or stenosis. Cerebral infarction codes identify the specific cerebral artery involved and the laterality. Cerebral vascular disease is basically insufficient blood to a part of the brain. It's usually secondary to atherosclerotic disease, hypertension, or very commonly both. We would use additional codes at the beginning to identify alcohol abuse or dependence, exposure to tobacco, smoke, tobacco dependence, and hypertension. The arteries that take blood to the brain through the neck are the carotid arteries and can have carotid artery stenosis, falling into code categories I-65.2. Occlusion stenosis of the precerebral arteries, including the carotid. An occlusion is basically some sort of obstruction. Stenosis is basically narrowing. And the code specifies laterality for whether it's right, left, bilateral, or unspecified. A cerebral infarction is similar to what we saw with the AMIs, except it's happening in the cerebral arteries. This results in ischemia to the brain and produces local brain tissue death. Also, this results in neurological deficits. This could be weakness, hemiplegia, hemiparalysis, cognitive deficits, and all different types of things. These codes, if for a default of a stroke with no other qualifying documentation, would be I-63.9. We have more specific codes falling under code category I-63. We only use the I-63.9 if there's no other specificity. Once somebody's had a stroke, we can have late effects or sequela of cerebral vascular disease. And in this code category, we can have sequela for specific conditions that remain after the initial stroke episode has been treated. These codes specify laterality, have revised code titles, and have additional 6 characters that provide greater detail or specificity. And late effects are differentiated between the type of the stroke, whether it's an hemorrhage where the blood vessel burst or an infarction. With code category I-69, the conditions identified here describe the condition that remains with the patient after the acute episode of the stroke is over. It can be permanent or only remain for a certain period of time. The original condition would be coded to a code from I-60 through I-67, and the sequela or late effects would be from I-69. This is where things go wrong. You need to carefully, very carefully, review the index to diseases to get the right sequela code because the type of cerebral vascular disease is precise. And again, with the neurological deficit, it's specified under the identified cause. And of course, with any late effect with ICD-10-CM coding, we want to use the main term of sequela that you can see in your alphabetic index. And the codes under code category I-69 are a combination of two facts. One, the cerebral vascular disease that caused the deficit, such as a non-traumatic subarachnoid hemorrhage, intracerebral hemorrhage, the infarction, and so on. Secondly, with a type of deficit, this could be cognitive, language, monoplegia, hemiplegia, dysphagia, facial weakness, ataxia, and others. History of a cerebral infarction with no neurological deficits is coded as Z86.73. How we would find that code would be history of. So this would be a history of cerebral infarction without residual deficits. The I-69 code can be used with a code from I-60 through 67 when a patient has current stroke and deficits remaining from an old stroke. So sometimes we'll have people that have late effects of an old stroke and then have a new one. Moving away from strokes, we get into VTEs and DVTs. This stands for the emboli, the venous thromboembolism, or the deep vein thrombosis. And these are specific codes that describe the acute and chronic deep and superficial vein thrombosis, or in other words, these clots. Category I-82 distinguishes between the location of the VTE and the acute and chronic status of the condition. Deep veins in the lower extremity include femoral, iliac, popliteal, tibial, and others. Superficial veins are greater or lesser saphenous in the lower extremities. And the deep veins in the upper extremity include the brachial, radial, and ulnar. Superficial veins include such things as the antecubital, cephalic, and so on. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Please reach out if you have any questions about coding diseases of the cardiovascular system. Bye now.